Hello, this is the fifth of my videos on the British anti-slavery movement, this one dealing with the abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean and other imperial territories. As I have noted in previous videos, slavery had effectively been ended in Britain itself by the Mansfield and Scottish verdicts in the 1770s, and after a 20-year-long struggle the British slave trade had been banned in 1807. Many abolitionists then assumed that their task was done, and that slavery in the British West Indies would automatically end as fresh slave imports were no longer available. They were also very aware of the considerable commercial and economic power of the Caribbean planter interests. By the 1820s, however, it had become obvious that slavery in the West Indies remained well established. It might well be that the slaves were better treated than they had been before the slave trade had been abolished, but the institution of slavery remained, and the lives of the slaves remained poor and wretched. Responding to this reality, in 1823, 16 years after abolition of the slave trade had been achieved, the core of the old abolitionist committee met to form the London Society for Mitigating and Gradually Abolishing the State of Slavery throughout the British Dominions. The Society's extreme caution was well expressed in its name. There would be no appeal for rapid action. Thomas Clarkson, now in his early 60s, was appointed as a member of the committee, and set off on another of his marathon tours of Britain to drum up support, travelling some 10,000 miles to deliver his message and encourage the formation of local organisations. Largely due to his efforts, 230 local branches of the local society were formed. As in the earlier anti-slave trade campaign, much emphasis was put on the preparation of petitions, and by 1824 some 777 petitions had been delivered to Parliament calling for the total abolition of slavery. Parliament's response was extremely limited. Choosing to focus only on the goal of improving the slaves' lives, the parliamentarians encouraged the recognition of slave marriages and the ending of the whipping of women slaves. But as responsibility for implementing these ideas was handed to the colonial assemblies, little or nothing was actually done. Calls for the London Society to make its demands with more urgency came from many of the rank-and-file members, particularly women, who came to criticize the gradualism of the Central Committee. A large meeting in London in May 1830 brought together over 2,000 activists, including Clarkson and Wilberforce, both now very elderly. Many younger participants felt that it was now time to demand immediate change, organizing their own separate national committee. The number of local abolitionist groups, meanwhile, soon topped 1,200. As before, the movement had a strong religious element, membership now including many Methodists and Baptists, as well as Quakers. The abolitionist renewal coincided with the campaign to effect parliamentary reform, and the abolitionists were well aware that only through reform were they likely to get favourable legislation passed in Parliament. Accordingly, for the new election for 1832, they campaigned directly for those candidates whom they knew to support their cause, and published lists of candidates tagged with their views on abolition, a distinctly modern form of political influence. To ensure that the new Reform Parliament remembered the question of slavery, a large march to the Prime Minister's office was organised early in 1833. Even without abolitionist pressure, the recent massive slave uprising in Jamaica in the winter of 1831-32 had alerted both government and Parliament to the problems of the sugar islands. It was clear that the Jamaican slaves had been only temporarily subdued, and high-ranking officials opined that a new insurrection was inevitable, and raised doubts whether the military could suppress it. Whether it was still economically viable for the government to support the planters to maintain slavery was thrown into doubt. Many Christians in Britain also raised their voices at the evident abuse of Christian missionaries in the Caribbean and of their slave co-religionists. Accordingly, after a lengthy debate, the bill to abolish slavery was passed by both Houses of Parliament in the summer of 1833, to take effect on the 1st of August 1834. The ban was to apply to the whole British Empire, except for the territories under the control of the East India Company, Ceylon, and the tiny Atlantic island of St. Helena. It was also decided to pay substantial compensation, £20 million in government bonds, to the former slave owners for their loss of property. This was equivalent to about 2/5 of the British national budget at the time. But as many Caribbean estates were mortgaged, much of this money went to the planters' London creditors. As a further concession to the slave owners, real emancipation for all slaves over the age of 5 was to be delayed for a period of involuntary apprenticeship, whilst they continued working for their former masters, until 1840 in the case of the field slaves, and until 1838 for the rest. As apprentices, the working week of the former slaves was fixed at a maximum of 45 hours. The abolitionists protested this measure as unjust, collecting another petition, this time of over 500,000 names. But more crucially, the new apprentices themselves also protested, staging strikes, marches, and demonstrations until the government compromised, reducing the length of the apprenticeship to 4 years, and so making the 1st of August 1838 the date of real freedom throughout the British West Indies, except for Trinidad, where the authorities had felt pressured by the potential apprentices to grant full immediate freedom in 1834. I will discuss moves towards the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in some other countries in the next video. Thank you.